This podcast may contain general advice, but it does not take into account anyone's personal circumstances, needs, or objectives. The scenarios and stocks mentioned in this podcast are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a recommendation to buy, hold, or sell any financial products. Importantly, the opinions expressed in this podcast are the personal views of the speakers and are not necessarily representative of BetaShares views. Thanks for tuning in to Practice Makes Perfect with your host, Damon Riscala.
Hi, this is Damon Riscala. I'm here for the Practice Makes Perfect podcast. And today I am joined by Dr. Michelle Cull from the Western Sydney University. Michelle, welcome.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you for having me here today.
No, thank you for joining us. We've got lots of questions for you. Of course, we should outline what you're an expert in. Financial planning and ethics, which is a very interesting topic, very relevant to all our financial planners out there. But before we delve into some of that, could you give us maybe just a little bit of a brief background on your history and your journey to where you are today?
Okay, I'll try to make it really brief and touch on some of the areas that I think are relevant to how I ended up here. So if we go back to even just growing up, I always had a bit of an interest in the things that my dad did when he was working in the bank. I used to work in a real estate while I was at school and picked up on a few things there from clients coming into the offices before mobile phones as well. I used to talk to the clients on the phone before they would come in. I would hear what the agents would be saying to them and a lot about discussions on the interest rates, which were very high at the time, and repayments and those sorts of things. So I was just always interested in that and just listening to conversations that talked about money. So then, of course, at school, when I studied commerce and later I did 3 economics, I really enjoyed that. And I knew that was sort of the area I wanted to work. But I actually ended up in an accounting cadetship. Mm-hmm. And I did that for a number of years. It was a 6-year cadetship. And then I had another position as a financial controller. And anyway, then, of course, I had my children, sort of changed the course of my career a little bit. I ended up, the company I was working for were wanting to keep me on board full time, and I found that very hard. I ended up having my first 2 children very close together within less than 12 months apart. So I had a few decisions to make, and I ended up having my own consulting business and then going in and working for the company that I had been previously an employee, but other companies as well. Really enjoyed doing that and having that freedom as well. And then I started teaching at the university. I thought I'd like to give back. I was just taking some classes at night. Had a lot of decisions that had to be made when I was in industry, and often a lot of it related back to ethics. And I remember thinking I'd like to really bring these real stories to life in the classroom and help students so that when they graduate, they're making good decisions. So I suppose it all started there. But mostly what I was teaching was in accounting. And I was being asked, we've got this compulsory financial planning subject. We'd like you to really teach this. And I was like, no, I'm not a financial planner. I don't feel comfortable teaching it. Anyway, there was a lot of pressure put on me. So I ended up taking one class, but I would sit in on all of the lectures of one of the other lecturers, the lead coordinator. And I did a lot of research to make sure I was up to scratch. And I really found I enjoyed it, and I felt like I wanted to do more in that space. Anyway, in the longer term, I ended up doing a PhD in financial planning and the role of trust in financial planning, and I ended up going on board full-time as an academic, and that's sort of where I've ended up now.
It's quite a journey, and you've now at the point where you've authored books and contributed largely to ethics, a lot of the thought processes around it. So that's why I'm so happy to have you here today, because we can throw a number of different questions at you, and we can safely say we're getting an expert opinion, which is great for our financial advisor audience out there. So, look, I might just throw the first one out there around the code of ethics. We've seen that sort of being developed, within financial planning over the last few years, and some of the obligations, that come with that, the creation of those obligations. What are your thoughts around the code of ethics and those obligations? Where do they sit? Just your general thoughts.
Okay, so I suppose that if we think about how the Code of Ethics was developed, and we look at other professions, if we want financial planning to be recognised as a profession, you would also expect that all professions have a code of ethics. If we think of doctors, lawyers, accountants, there's all codes of ethics there that help them in their everyday job. But we also have professional judgment that needs to be applied in that, and that's where we look at ethical decision making as well. But in financial planning, if you were not a member of a professional body that had a code of ethics, you could still be practicing as a financial planner and not have to follow a code of ethics. And that's where I suppose the first issue arose. But also on the back of a lot of the big corporate collapses that we saw, and the Ripoll report that talked about those corporate collapses, the Ripoll report actually had in the recommendation that there should be a code of ethics. But at that stage, it still looked like that code of ethics would be something that the industry would develop for itself and it would be self-regulated like with other professions. But of course, that didn't happen. I do know some professional bodies did review their codes of ethics and make them, I suppose, raise the standards through that. But once again, not all financial planners had to be a member of a professional body that had a code of ethics. So then we had the Royal Commission. We've had a lot of reviews, a lot of parliamentary inquiries, and then that's where the government decided, no, we're actually going to legislate this and put it into the corporations law. So I suppose with the obligations there, the obligations are that financial planners are going to be making ethical decisions when it comes to their clients that are in the best interests of their clients. So it all surrounds that best interest duty.
Sure.
But on the other side, it also ensures that all financial planners understand the obligations that they have and they're applied consistently.
Yeah. And I think that's probably, to your point, that's probably quite key, that it can be applied consistently over the industry and all the participants in the industry. In terms of the types of issues that it's trying to prevent and protect against, what do you think the most common ones are? What stands out?
Well, the Code of Ethics really came about because it was to protect consumers.
Sure.
So that's the main reason. But it also protects the financial planners themselves because it provides them with a guideline to help them make their decisions. And if they're following the Code of Ethics, then they shouldn't find themselves in hot water, you would think.
Yeah. Have you seen historically, I guess, were there any particular scenarios that stood out to you where you looked at it from afar and said, gee whiz, that's a scenario that would never have happened, had there been a code of ethics in place, at that point in time?
I can't pinpoint any one scenario. I think it's just been a build-up over time. And also, I mean, my PhD was in the role of trust in personal financial planning.
Sure.
And I think a lot came out of that PhD. So when I was undertaking that PhD, at that time there was no code of ethics. But from speaking with clients, I continually got from clients about that they would expect that their financial planner was ethical. And also another thing, and I don't know if you're going to touch on this later, but clients would say that often they would make judgments about their financial planners based on their position in the community and how they behaved in their own lives as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes people try to separate their professional life from their personal life, but there is often that overlap. And when you're looking at professionals, people view professionals as, that one person, that the personal and professional combined. So I think there's still a little bit more we can do in that space. But in terms of protecting the consumer, I think that being aware of your ethical obligations and having a process to actually think through and reflect upon what you're doing every day and why you're making the decisions you're making, I think can always help somebody to make more ethical decisions down the track.
Yeah, that's really interesting about how consumers view, the two sides of the coin in terms of dealing with a financial planner and their expectations, perhaps about their behaviour outside of that role as a financial planner. That's a very good point. On the topic of ethical standards, how do you see those changing over time to reflect changes in community? Obviously, as the years march by, no matter what generation we're in, expectations of the community do change. How do you see that playing out? How do you see those standards changing and reflecting what's happening in the community at large?
I actually don't think that the ethical standards will necessarily change. That's my personal opinion.
Sure.
I think what does change, though, is the legislation. And this is where the lines get blurred a little bit, because traditionally we think of ethics being above the law. And in this case, the Code of Ethics is the law. So legislation does change with community standards. We usually find that legislation changes because of the pressure put on by the community. And I think even the Code of Ethics itself came out of that, because there were consumers who had been hurt by unethical advisors. Even though a very small number of advisors, they did a lot of damage.
Yeah.
And I think that put a lot of pressure then on the government to incorporate it in the legislation. So if the community finds that there's something that they want advisors to do that they feel would raise their standards, then of course that might change what's in the legislation. But in terms of ethical standards themselves, I think that doesn't change over time. But I will qualify that. An individual, if we look at moral development, an individual can change over time, usually for the better.
we hope so. We hope so.
And that's what the research suggests, that people become more ethical as they become older. But there are other environmental considerations as well as part of that.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think what I've seen in my time in funds management, historically, we sort of see mini episodes blow up, whether it was the sort of some of the gearing fiascos that we saw, or some of the things that happened in agribusiness, or perhaps accountants, giving some advice in some of those facets. And you see that when there's a bit of a falling apart in those scenarios, that's when the community tends to demand change, and it then tends to happen, as you say, through legislation. In terms of systems or processes that advisors can implement into their business and the way that they do business to try and meet those ethical obligations, what would your advice be to an advisor who says, look, I am really looking for some strong processes and systems that can help me out?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I think, of course, ensuring that all of your staff have got the right training to start with, and ongoing training, and we have that also legislated in terms of the CPD of advisors, but not just the advisors, but other members of the practice should also have training in ethics. But the processes and systems are really key here. So making sure that you're keeping good file notes, you have systems that you can back that up. You're not going to lose those file notes, that they're easy to access for the people that need them, that they're easy to understand, very clearly outline why decisions were made and recommendations were made, when meetings took place, what was discussed. The more detail that you can include, the better, because that's going to protect you should there be any sort of misunderstanding in the future. And of course, the Code of Ethics really embraces the legislation that talks about best interest duty. So as long as you can outline how you meet the best interests of your clients. I think some practices like to use checklists as well, just as another means of making sure all the right processes have been followed, but just have to be very careful that it's not a minimalistic type of approach there as well. And there's also a lot of different ethical decision-making frameworks that can be applied. So you might even have a basic framework that your practice might want to utilise, so that if an advisor has some sort of decision that they have to make that usually is unexpected. A lot of problems that people have is when they have to make a decision that's unexpected. If you know that a decision is going to have to be made, and you can go and get all of the information and take your time in making a decision.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course that's recommended.
Yeah.
But sometimes, this is what with ethics, things just happen sometimes that you just don't see coming. So And you need to be able to have some sort of framework to think through a process and how you're going to deal with those situations.
Yeah. And on the topic of those frameworks, where can they be sourced from? Is that something that an advisor would develop internally within their business? Are there some different options externally for an advisor to go, okay, here's a framework that's commonly used that I can apply to some of these issues? Or is it more driven from internal within that business?
It's a bit of both.
Yeah.
So there are some commonly used frameworks that are talked about in the literature and in a lot of the ethics training that occurs. So we've got like a 6-step process, 3-step processes, but just where it's asking the individual different questions to ensure that they've got all the information that they need before they make a decision. They're not just making a rash decision based on one piece of information. And also considering all the different courses of action. So initially you may think there's only 2 courses of action, but there may actually be something else. So trying to think a little bit more carefully, a bit more out of the box about solving some sort of ethical dilemma and where everybody is happy with the solution.
Yeah, good advice. And of course, if anyone's wanting to look into that, they could always go out and grab your book as well.
They could.
and I am pleased to say that Beta Shares hopefully will be partnering with you to deliver some materials over the coming sort of time period. So we look forward to that. One of the other things that I'm curious about is the most common ethical challenges that an advisor faces. Do you have a take on that? Are there particular scenarios that come up more often than others that sort of really throw people when they're considering these types of issues?
Well, this is something where we probably could collect some more data to see where advisors are having these issues. But if we just look at complaints that are made, I think a lot of it can come back to the notes that are being kept. Sure. And making sure that you're making decisions that are in the best interests of the clients and documenting that. Yeah. Because at the time you might think something through and think you're making the right decision, but if it's not documented, you haven't got that evidence. Yeah. So it's really important to have that. And you're not always going to remember everything down the track. So keeping the right file notes and following the right processes, and that's where the licensee can really be of help to their staff.
And would you recommend with it, because I think you're spot on. If I think most advisors would have, would be having hundreds and hundreds of client conversations a year, which are, it'd be impossible to recall those, right. 2 or 3 years down the track. So you think it's very important to not only just record those, but the reasons why those decisions have been made as well.
That's right. So supporting it with evidence.
Yeah. Okay. When we look across the landscape, and you did mention it earlier, that a number of other professions had the opportunity to develop their own code of ethics over time. If we look at the legal industry, accounting, we've seen that. What can we learn from those industries, the way that they've developed their code of ethics and how it's worked for them? Have you seen any particular takeaways as to what's worked really, really well with those industries and perhaps what hasn't worked so well?
Well, what has worked well is where professional bodies have been able to work together. Yeah. And so there's a real common understanding of all members of that profession as to what their obligations are. And that is key when we're looking at a code of ethics, because even if you look at the legislated code of ethics for financial planners, it talks about keeping your peers I'm sorry, I'm lost for words here, but ensuring that your peers are doing the right thing and upholding the same standards. Sure. So that's something that was done very well in other professions. Yeah. I think because there were so many different professional bodies in financial planning, that's what had made that really difficult. So although individual professional bodies had their own code of ethics, there were some differences, and some professional bodies actually didn't have any either. Yeah. So that's what has worked really well. I think something else to consider is the international landscape, because even if we look at legislation as a starting point, legislation is different across different countries. If we then overlay that with the ethical framework, what can happen is it can cause some conflict between what the legislation states and what the values might, or principles in a code of ethics might state. So that's where sometimes there needs to be a little bit more work, and it can cause some problems. I mean, you think just looking at legislation and the sorts of things that can differ between countries, even between states within our own country.
Yeah.
The legislation can be very different. So if we take something that was very controversial, looking at euthanasia, for example, so that's in the legislation in some states and not in other states. And how does that lie within an ethical framework? So you can see it can get very complex and very messy.
Great point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that, but it's very true. On the topic of, I guess ramifications, when there are breaches that have occurred, what's the ramification for the advisors concerned? What's the best way for them to deal with it? How do they get on the front foot?
Wow, too many questions there. Okay, well, if we just look at some of the ramifications, there could be potentially they could lose their license.
Mm-hmm.
They could maybe be fined. Maybe it might be that they need to go away and do some more training.
Mm-hmm.
There are some potential ramifications. Depending on how serious the issue, there could be other, I suppose, legal issues that they might have to confront, may be noted on the financial advisor register.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a couple of things just there. Not to even then think about the personal shame that someone would feel. I mean, sometimes these things that happen are very, as I said, even making decisions can be very unexpected, although there's always going to be people who know what the right thing is and still choose not to do the right thing.
Of course.
Often, a lot of the time, it's inadvertent. But we can't say, if just like with the law, if you're driving down the road and you're doing 60 and it's a school zone, you can't say that you didn't see the sign.
Yeah.
Right? So we can't be ignorant of what's expected of us. But of course, we've got to think about a lot of that personal reflection that would be going on. And it's always a very upsetting time for everybody involved. So the client, the licensee, the advisor. So the ramifications are not just the legal ramifications, but there's a lot of personal ramifications there, and then the reputation that surrounds all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That if it's listed on a register, quite often this stuff makes the media as well. There is going to be, aside from the professional ramifications, also personal ones with some of those feelings that people might have to deal with. I assume that your advice to those people would be to get on the front foot, be open about it, and obviously
absolutely be open about it. Keep the lines of communication open. And, it's always helpful to have somebody, a colleague or somebody who you can really trust and talk to about if you feel like you're facing something. It might not be a huge issue to start with, but something that's on your conscience that you're just not feeling comfortable about. Don't try to push it away. Don't hide it. Talk to someone about it and just make sure that you're doing all the things that you can to ensure that you're not doing the wrong thing as well.
Yeah, and by doing that, I guess particularly if you're going through that issue and working through those issues, whatever they may be, if you've got the ability to talk to a colleague or someone within the license, they may be able to give you some advice and help before it escalates even further.
Exactly. That's right. And there are also some free hotlines that you can call and talk to people anonymously about any issues.
Yeah.
And that can really help just to sort of get your thoughts sorted, because often there's a lot of emotion involved as well. And it can be really tough.
Yeah, I can imagine. You earlier mentioned that the community's expectations are not just professional, but also merge into the personal type conduct of financial advisors. So my question then is, when advisors are dealing with third parties that aren't necessarily clients, how do their ethical expectations extend out to those third parties? So whether it be their dealings with fund managers or platforms, or just, I don't know, someone down the street that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, or their own personal accountant. Where is the line drawn, if it's drawn?
Wow. Okay. because most of the code of ethics refers directly to the relationship between the client and the advisor. But if we go back to even keeping accurate notes, and this is a requirement of the code of ethics as well. So those notes are often used by third parties if you need to maybe have the client moves on to another planner, or you need somebody else working with them. So that's something that might influence third parties. I'm just trying to think of maybe some other ways that might happen. I suppose if people are relying on your expertise, then you just have to be aware of very conscious, and aware of what it is that you're saying or how you're presenting something to those third parties.
Yeah, and it may be a case that something sort of accidentally comes out that someone could rely upon, and as professionals, that's very easy for that to occur.
It is. So making it very clear if it's something that you shouldn't be maybe discussing with them, maybe you need to tell them that you can't discuss it with them because of those reasons, and just being self-aware, I think. Yeah.
No, that's good advice. Everything that we've spoken about so far is very practical. I want to delve into more some of the academic side of things. Can you give us some insight into the different ethical theories that exist?
Okay, there are many ethical theories, but most people wouldn't probably have the time to go and read through all of them. There are two main ethical theories that are discussed that most financial advisors probably covered in their CPD for ethics. So we've got the two main approaches are the deontological approach and the teleological approach. So with the deontological approach, it's based more on a sense of duty. So you make your decisions based out of rules that you might have in place. Often it could be, if you're looking at people's personal values and sense of duty, they might have religious obligations, for example. In this case, we've also got the code of ethics, so they're actually making a decision based on what duty they have to a client. But it focuses more on how they've made the decision, not what the actual outcome is.
Okay.
So they're making the decision because of the duty that they have to the client. Whereas the teleological approach is also referred to as consequentialism, because that refers to more what the outcome is going to be to the client. So you've probably heard the terms the end justifies the means, or the end.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So the end justifies the means would be a teleological approach, or if the end doesn't justify the means, that would be a deontological approach.
Okay.
So one's more concerned about how you make the decision, and the other one's more concerned with the outcomes. And with the teleological approach or consequentialism, it's also measuring those outcomes based on happiness. And that's very subjective, so it's hard to measure that.
Sure.
But when we look at the code of ethics, it's actually a principles-based ethics code. So that's actually incorporating a little bit of the sense of duty. So we've got the best interest duty, okay? So that would be a deontological approach. And then we also have looking at what the consequences are for the client, looking at their the long-term impact of the recommendations that you make. So that would be more the teleological approach.
So we're seeing both at play with the responsibilities that advisors have got. A bit of each of those theories comes into play.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. But there are other theories. And virtue ethics is another one. So with virtue ethics, we're looking more at, we talked earlier about how people can become more ethical over time. So it uses a lot of training, observing, I suppose also reflecting on situations. So this is also very relevant. And then you've got a new area of ethics, which is called care ethics. So if we look at that sort of theory, it focuses more on the relationship between people. That's got the primary focus. So it's a little bit different to some of the others.
Yeah, so there's quite a variety there. Look, and I think it's interesting to note that there are different frameworks and theories that can be used. Could you explain what moral development is and how it affects how people respond to ethical situations.
Okay, so moral development is a way of looking at, I suppose, how people make their decisions. So it looks more at what processes you go through to make your final decision rather than what that actual decision is. But moral development, it was introduced by a child psychologist. In fact, this is where it all started.
Okay.
And it basically identifies that there's 6 stages of reasoning that people undertake.
Mm-hmm.
And at each stage, you're improving how you make those decisions, and you're becoming, I suppose, more principled in your approach. So if I use an example of the 6 stages, we divide the 6 stages up into 3 main areas. So we've got what we call pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. So pre-conventional at stages 1 and 2, that's where you'd usually find children to be. So they might just know that you don't do something because you might get hurt.
Yeah.
All right. So it's very basic, or that there'll be some sort of punishment.
Sure.
But as you go up each stage, it's looking more at cooperation, how you work with other people, how you interact with other people, and how you organise your activities with others. So then if we get to sort of like stage 3, it's all about be nice to people, consider how other people might feel, starting to bring a bit of empathy into it. Stage 4 would be following the law. That's sort of an equivalent of that there. And then what we call post-conventional is what is above the law there. So it's stages 5 and 6. So at stage 5, that's where the sense of duty might really come into play.
Yeah. Okay. From an advisor's perspective, so that's interesting, thinking about moral development and how it progresses. Obviously, people do have the capacity to improve the way that they think about ethics and what they're doing morally. And we probably have touched on it a little bit earlier, but how can advisors improve their ethical awareness? Is there anything so training obviously being one of them, looking at not just training themselves, but potentially their staff as well. Are there other things that an advisor could do or adopt to try and improve in that space?
Absolutely, there is. I mean, ethical awareness needs to happen for you to be able to make an ethical decision. If you don't know that something is actually an ethical dilemma, how can you make a choice about it?
Mm.
Okay, so I mean, even if you look at a lot in the past, if we look at some really terrible events that have happened in history where people have said they were just following orders, that is a very black and white approach. It's not necessarily an ethical approach. It's easy to just blame it on following orders. But this is why ethics is something that's always talked about and questioned, and there's all these different perspectives, because it isn't black and white. And if we just go back a minute to the principled thinking, when you go beyond that following the law, and what we refer to as principled thinking is really thinking through those different alternative courses of action. And really, just because something might be stated in the law, it doesn't always mean that might be the most ethical thing to do. And as I mentioned earlier, laws are different in different states, different countries. And sometimes I'd like to try to use an example that's sort of easy for people to follow. If we look at somebody who's sort of been seen to be, without sin. If we look at Jesus, for example, right? Whether you think it's fact or fiction,
example.
If you think of it as fact or fiction, right? But something simple like the 10 Commandments, and there was the commandment that you shouldn't work on the Sabbath, and Jesus healed a girl on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees were saying, "Oh, he's done the wrong thing. He didn't obey the 10 Commandments." That's very much black and white following the law.
Sure.
But if we look at that as an example of principled reasoning, that's where you're actually making a judgment call on really what should you do. Should you follow the law and not heal somebody and let them die? Mm. So you can see how ethics is a little bit more involved than that. So that's where it takes you up to the principled thinking, cooperating with others, interacting with others.
Yeah. And so in terms of that, cooperating, interacting, so we spoke about it before, maybe find some colleagues that advisors can share their experiences with within their dealer group. Is there is there anyone else that you think of that an advisor could talk to reach out and have a conversation with prior to them making a decision about something that's, for them is a little bit questionable?
Yes. So, I mean, a lot of practices now have independent people that their planners can call, even if it's going to see, like if they've got some sort of access scheme, like a counsellor or something, just somebody who can listen. And sometimes it just helps to get it out and talk to somebody just about how you're feeling first and unpack that. But there's things like the St. James Ethics Centre where they've got the ethical number, and you can ring them and talk to somebody and they'll sort of take you through some of those steps and ask you questions just to be able to reflect on different aspects of the situation. So you did ask me earlier, and I've been a bit off track, about moral awareness. So that moral awareness can be improved by having those reflective exercises. So just, reflecting on something that's happened, reflecting on maybe if you've heard something that's happened in the media, and, just unpacking, well, how did that happen? What can I learn from that so that I don't repeat that same mistake? So I think learning through other people and other stories, talking, communication, reflecting, and continuing to undertake training and reading in that area. And that's probably the best way to be aware, because if you are not doing that and you're not interacting with your peers, you're not able to then necessarily identify maybe an ethical problem that might arise. If you haven't faced that before, you might be completely oblivious that that's a potential risk that could come up. So, no one's perfect, and people all make bad decisions at some part of their life. So we're not saying that everyone is going to be perfect, but we are trying to ensure that the imperfection doesn't get to a stage where you're unaware and you're not putting things in place to ensure that it doesn't become a bigger issue. And of course, when you're advising clients, you want to make sure that you're not impacting other people because of it.
Yeah, and there's some very, very key ways. I think that's a great summary of how advisors can develop a framework for dealing with issues, particularly if they're confronted with a scenario that they're a little bit confused about. So thank you for that, for those insights. Now I do have one final question for you. How do you see ethics interacting with the best interests duty? Where are the parallels? Where does one overlap the other?
Okay, so if you look at the Code of Ethics, in the Code of Ethics itself, the Standard 2 actually says that you must provide advice that's in the best interest of the client. So it's a very clear parallel. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So if you follow the Code of Ethics, it should follow that you are providing advice that's in the best interests of the clients. The Code of Ethics also talks about looking at the long-term interests of the clients and how that might impact on the client. It talks about record keeping. Upholding the code, making sure your peers are doing the right thing. So, and this also, I suppose, the best interest duty, if you want to ensure that you are providing advice in the best interest of your client. If there's something you're unsure about, as we said before, talk about it with somebody.
Yeah.
Maybe licensees could have regular meetings with their staff, little huddles, saying, okay, what's going on? Anything bothering anybody at the moment that you want to talk about? I think getting it from the subconscious to the conscious by talking about it, it actually does that. Because sometimes things will be in the back of someone's mind and you're not always fully aware of how it's going to influence your actions. By talking about it, you do become more self-aware, and that comes back to your ethical awareness.
Yeah, and I guess coming out of that, if you're running a financial planning business, having those little huddles where you give people the opportunity to bring up some of those issues, I think is really valuable, because that may be the way that you discover some things preemptively and you can actually deal with them then and there before it becomes a bigger issue, by actively engaging and listening to some of those problems that staff within the business might be facing. So
that's right. And even when we talked about keeping accurate records and notes, that can also act as a way of self-reflection. If there are any issues, and going back to the notes and seeing maybe how things could have been done differently. That's another way, looking at learning lessons. If you've got any sort of client complaints, obviously they all need to be investigated, but what can you learn from those so that doesn't happen again? And knowing that client complaints don't necessarily mean that the advisors have done anything wrong, but still if the client's making a complaint, there's still some risks there. So what can you take away and learn from that and improve in your practice?
Well, Dr. Michelle Cull, I think that's all we've got time for today, but thank you so much for being part of our podcast. I think there's been some incredibly useful tips for our advisor audience out there, and we look forward to speaking to you again at some stage in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Damon. I look forward to it.
Thank you.